Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and welcome to Shadowproof's YouTube channel. I'm here for a discussion with Mickey Huff and Andy Lee Roth, who are both managers and directors at Project Censored. They're going to be talking about State of the Free Press 2023. Take a moment before we bring them in to hit like on this video, share it, let people know we're having this discussion, and also make sure you're a subscriber to the Shadowproof YouTube channel so you know when we're hosting discussions like this and when we're posting new content to our channel. With that housekeeping item out of the way, let me bring in my good friends and colleagues. Hello there. Let me take this down. Andy, hello. Mickey, thank you for joining me today. As I mentioned, Andy Lee Roth, Mickey Huff, you are both involved with Project Censored. Who wants to take the job of letting people know very basically what Project Censored is before we get into the work that you do annually, which is this State of the Free Press that I have here that you do annually to analyze media, the ecosystem, and also go over censored stories and junk food news from the past year?
I'll jump in really quickly on that one. Project Censored was founded in 1976 in Northern California at Sonoma State University. We've since expanded. We're a nonprofit under the Media Freedom Foundation. We work with a couple dozen campuses all around the country. Andy can talk more about some of our campus affiliates program that he directs. But in a nutshell, we're a critical media literacy education organization. You mentioned we publish an annual book for years with 7 Stories Press, now the Censored Press. We're in partnership with them. We publish the top underreported stories of each year. So while teaching critical media literacy education, we also point out the shortcomings of establishment, corporate, or legacy media, what they do and don't cover, how they frame news. We define what censorship actually is in the digital era, right? The definitions haven't really changed from our perspective, but the media landscape has changed. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about what's similar and different about that today. But Project Censored is a free press organization. We support a truly open, transparent, free press. We oppose censorship in its many guises. We are critical of corporate media propaganda and censorship, but also affirmative and supportive when they do cover important matters factually and truthfully, right? It's not all false or all censorship all the time. It's a very nuanced kind of thing that we do, which sometimes is lost on folks, especially as we are in a more polarized political climate. But we also highlight the really important independent and alternative non-corporate journalism every year. And those stories end up in our book. And the validated independent news stories that are the core of the stories that end up on our ballot each year are all on our website, projectcensored.org, for free. We look at a couple hundred stories every year, and it kind of gets distilled down. And there's a lot of patterns in the kinds of stories that have been underreported over the years. And Kevin, maybe we'll talk about that. And I'm sure Andy can speak more specifically to that.
All right. So to get us started, I frame this discussion as being focused on the Billionaire Press, which is a large part of the introduction to your book. So I've got this quote to get us kicked off here. So I'm going to put this on the screen here. First, for everyone, this is the book from Censored Press. If you go to the Censored Press website, or if you look for Project Censored, you can find this book and its details and where you can get a copy. But also, this is the quote I wanted to start us with. And there may be a little bit that we're losing here, but I start with: history shows that consolidated media controlled by a handful of elite owners seldom serves the public interest. In pursuit of their own interests and investments, media tycoons, past and present, again and again, appear to be conveniently oblivious to the mainframe through which they filter news, that of class, including class structure and class interests. Consequently, they often overlook or ignore conflicts of interest that implicate media owners, funders, investors, and advertisers, not to mention their business clients on Wall Street and in big pharma, big tech, and the military-industrial complex. This reality helps explain the lack of corporate news coverage on topics such as wage theft, which implicates the nation's largest employers, runaway inflation, partly the consequence of corporate consolidation, and the lack of investment in public transportation. Those are a few example topics. And that's from you, Andy, and Mickey in your book. So I'll take that down off the screen here and say that, to get us started, why don't we begin with addressing that lack of class analysis in the news and how that billionaire influence means that we're not getting stories that accurately represent what people are going through. For keeping it topical, the last year was dominated by inflation, for example. And yet we could say very confidently that we didn't actually talk about what the root causes were of inflation, possibly because of those billionaires that are influencing our media ecosystem.
That's right, Kevin. And so to kind of first zoom out to a big perspective and then come back in and focus on, for instance, how establishment press have covered inflation in the last 12 to 24 months in the United States. But if we go back looking historically, from William Randolph Hearst, the Hearst Empire, including the Los Angeles Times, up to, Elon Musk, as the quotation you've presented from the introduction to this year's book suggests, when we have consolidated media, and that consolidated media is held in the hands of a minority of elites, the public interest is seldom served. And the pattern that we can see looking back over nearly 50 years of Project Censored surveys of the state of the free press are that stories about corporate misconduct, stories about government corporate collusion, stories more generally about conflicts of interest, and maybe notably as well, stories about press censorship are all story types that tend to be treated only partially by the corporate media in both senses of that term. Incomplete, partial meaning both incomplete, and partial also meaning in a slanted or biased way, or those stories are blockaded altogether. Now, the latter is rare. Most of the time, what we find is that story coverage amounts to corporate news story coverage of these controversial topics amounts to what we could think of as indirect censorship. And my favorite metaphor for how indirect censorship works comes from a 1977 article in the Index on Censorship by Eduardo Galeano, who talked about indirect censorship in terms of this metaphor. The ship, he wrote, doesn't sail because there's simply no water in the sea, right? So I think when a lot of people in the United States think about censorship, they think about government censorship, kind of top-down censorship that in legal circles is known as prior restraint. An authority of some kind saying, you can't write or say that. That is one important form of censorship. We know examples of that here in the United States, even despite First Amendment protections against it. But far more often, we have the ship not sailing not because someone has said the ship isn't allowed to sail, but because there's no water in the sea. And those are the kinds of stories that Project Censored has tried to track and bring to wider public attention for the entirety of its existence since its establishment in 1976.
And I'm really glad that, there's an organization that is committed to doing that kind of a work to really focus on this. And you pick out the tech billionaires, which I want to come back to towards the end of our discussion, but you're really focused on the rise of these billionaires that come from Google, the company formerly known as Facebook, and Twitter, and all these people like Bill Gates who have taken ownership of these media organizations, or even like ailing media organizations who were in really a bad state and needed that injection of wealth and accepted it at great cost.
Mhm.
But you know, you mentioned that oligarchic owners now engage in this new form of censorship. In the book, you have a whole section that follows this censorship by proxy. Why don't you? Because you were getting to that as you were mentioning the Galliano quote, and you were going through this. Why don't maybe Mickey, you could flesh out this whole concept of censorship by proxy for our viewers.
Sure, I'm happy to start that, and then Andy can certainly add in. There's a lot to discuss as far as this topic goes. We've been
Definitely.
talking about censorship by proxy for some time. Because of the narrow legalistic type of definition that you heard Andy mention a little bit ago on prior restraint, because of the focus on that, folks often don't necessarily consider the kind of stories that we're covering to be truly censored because they're available. Well, no kidding. If they were actually totally censored, no one would know about them. Are there stories that exist like that? Well, I'm sure there are. And we know that because of, well, people like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and whistleblowers, right? And that's your sort of wheelhouse, Kevin. So we know that there are stories that that governments and agencies and others try to suppress, but there are also corporations and major billionaires and moguls that own the press and that are owners and major key players and stakeholders in big tech, etc. They also curate and control the kind of information that is available and that we see, except that the difference is often the public doesn't necessarily see that as, quote, censorship, unless it's silencing a voice that they like or want to hear, right? So it's very selective. And one of the arguments we always hear is that, well, Twitter's a private company. They can do what they want. But when you have these major companies that have really captured the public square in the 21st century, it becomes incredibly problematic to cede that kind of legalistic territory to a handful of major oligarchs, the Billionaire Press. You know, Upton Sinclair decried this in the brass check, almost a century ago. A.J. Liebling, we write about this, wrote about it in the New Yorker. Freedom of the press belongs to those who own one. Ben Bigdikian, canary in the coal mine, warned about the media monopoly in the 80s. Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky warned about the ownership of media and the conflicts of interest. This isn't really new, but we're applying it to the big tech sector because many Americans these days, half people in the United States, are going to social media platforms to get news, and these aren't journalistic outlets. So it's incredibly problematic. The kind of censorship, shadow banning, deplatforming, these types of things that are happening by proxy. And Andy maybe can take over and talk about a couple of the examples that we wrote about in the book that are very clear examples of censorship by proxy, whether it's PayPal freezing accounts, cable companies dumping stations. I mean, there's a multitude of examples of this that go far beyond Twitter. Andy.
Yeah. So, I mean, as we define it, there are three key characteristics to identify what we call censorship by proxy. First, there have to be restrictions on freedom of information or expression that are undertaken, as we define it, by private corporations. These restrictions, second criteria, exceed what would be possible if the government were the restricting entity. And third, these restrictions serve the interests of either the corporations themselves and or the government or some other third party, right? So the idea, the by proxy notion is that if, playing back to how people tend to think of censorship and focusing on governments as the primary agents of censorship, increasingly now, for the reasons we're talking about, changes in technology, our digital online world, tech companies play that gatekeeping role, even though they don't necessarily think of themselves as censors or gatekeepers. They are, in fact, gatekeeping. They're digital gatekeepers. And because of that, we can talk about the potential for, in effect, collusions of power and influence between government and corporate entities. And probably the clearest example of this is something that I know people following Shadowproof will have tracked, which is how after in February of last year, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. Version of RT, the Russian broadcasting system, RT America is the U.S. version, was effectively shut down following the Russian invasion of Ukraine early in 2022. Now, I'll say more about the history of this in a moment, but just on the, like, at the time, what happened was that DirecTV, Roku, Sling TV, and Dish TV, all under pressure from the public in what would count sociologically as a kind of moral panic, decided to discontinue their broadcasting of RT America and its full slate of programs, which included, by the way, Pulitzer Prize winning journalists, people like Chris Hedges, as well as Abby Martin, who's known to anyone who follows Shadowproof and Project Censored's work. All their work was disappeared. So this fits the first criteria of defining censorship by proxy. What about the government interests? This is where we have to go back a little bit before February of 2022. In January of 2017, there was a joint intelligence community assessment that was looking at the role of Russian entities on the 2016 election, that specifically singled out Russian media and RT in particular as threats to the integrity of American democracy. In November of that same year, 2017, under pressure from the Department of Justice, all of RT America's journalists had to register as foreign agents under the Foreign Agents the Foreign Agents Regulation Act, FARA, F-A-R-A. And as the Committee to Protect Journalists noted at the time, the stigma of journalists having to register as foreign agents, including U.S. born and based journalists, people like Hedges and Martin, the stigma of that foreign agent's status hampered their ability to do their jobs. It also then, from the point of view of thinking about censorship by proxy, indicates the U.S. government's interest in regulating, if not shutting down, RT America. So that when that actually happened in early 2022, following this kind of popular American uprising against all things Russian in the face of the invasion, it wasn't the U.S. government that shut RT America down. It was Roku, Sling TV, Dish, DirecTV. But it certainly served the interests of the U.S. government, and it probably allowed the U.S. government to fulfill a goal of its without facing any kind of blowback for having censored a foreign entity or censored the press. I'm sorry, I should be more specific. Censoring the press organization of a foreign country. Now, just one more footnote on this as an example of censorship by proxy. The government requirement that RT America employees register as foreign agents is a standard that's been selectively instituted, right? Journalists who work for the BBC and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation don't have to register as foreign agents. They have not been pressured to do so by the Department of Justice. So there are, as other people, including folks at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, have documented, kind of conflicts of interest in how that status, how that regulatory status gets implemented. But the bigger picture is that here's a case where now RT America is off the air. RT America was not without its flaws or problems, but it also provided a platform for a number of people with serious credentials as journalists who were outspoken critics of U.S. foreign policy to share perspectives that expanded the normally narrow definition of who and what count as newsworthy. And along with that, it's worth adding, YouTube followed suit and basically deleted whole channels of information, including the archives of Chris Hedges' program and Abby Martin's. So, if we're any kind of definition that defines censorship in terms of restrictions on the free flow of information and expression, these actions certainly fall under that category, but they deserve this special kind of acknowledgement that this wasn't the US government doing this directly. It was censorship by proxy through corporate entities.
Yeah. So just to give you an idea of some of the engagement in our discussion, I know this is always beneficial to you as the authors. I'd like to just share a few things I have coming in here. One, technology should be well regulated so it is not used to suppress the people in the society. And then also I appreciated this sentiment that posting and accessing information today is a lot easier to monitor and manipulate today than in the 1980s. And then it's worth mentioning in connection to a point that you're raising about the registering of foreign agents and what was done to RT, that here on this channel, I've hosted several discussions, conversations, breakdowns of what's going on and has gone on with Trump and his taking of classified documents to the Mar-a-Lago estate and how the FBI raided him. And when I go to share that video and monetize it with ads like all people do for their channels or might choose to do for their channels, I am told that I can only have limited ads on it because John Kiriakou is seen as somebody who is an agent of Russia because he had the Sputnik channel banned, or he was part of that organization when Sputnik was banned from YouTube and can no longer broadcast. And I assume that there's a list in which YouTube believes that shows might be doing a workaround by having people from the organization on their shows. And so we are not to have people connected to these organizations on our news programs, which means that today, as news is breaking about Joe Biden having classified documents and people want to do this kind of equivalency between Trump's actions versus Biden's actions and break it down and have discussions that I think are actually rather abstract and academic. I can't have John Kiriakou on and do a full show about that without facing the fact that he might not be the best guest for me to make the most money on my channel if I have him on as a guest. And who knows, maybe that might be some income that I'm counting on in order to do my work as an independent journalist. So just something to put out there. We're thinking about this censorship by proxy question and how subtle it can be.
Kevin, we wrote in the book, PayPal is a classic example. Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. PayPal tried to demonetize Consortium News, founded by the great muckraker Bob Perry. They did the same to Mint Press News and Manar Adley. They actually froze Alan McLeod, the independent journalist's account who writes for Mint Press News. I mean, so this is a direct attack. This is a direct proxy attack to silence voices that are critical of the state, critical of capitalism in general, critical of imperialism. We could rattle off the list there. And again, this amounts to a form of censorship. So we think that censorship by proxy is a far more pervasive and insidious form of censorship that we need to be focusing on, not just old notions of prior restraint.
And then another example that people who follow this may know about, which you get into in the book, is Newsguard. How do you place that in the Billionaire Press? Let me just say that one point that I'm not sure you exactly make in the book, but it probably is implied, is that some of these fact-checking tools, so to speak, or some of these so-called ways to monitor disinformation or misinformation in the news seem to have this appeal to the executives or management of these corporations or media firms because they can ensure that their brand won't be tarnished by material that will be deemed as propaganda or fake news or false information. It helps them ensure that their product can be sold to consumers, media consumers, without fear of a backlash.
We know that that's true. There are advertising block lists, as they're called, that include up to 70,000 words that brands can coordinate with entities that make it their business to assemble and then implement these block lists to protect the corporate brand's image. We know from reports that this is affecting the news coverage of humanitarian crises. So if terms such as refugee, or for that matter, humanitarian crisis, appear on the block list, that will create financial disincentives of exactly the sort you've just described for yourself, Kevin, for any news outlet that is interested in reporting on, say, the refugee crisis in wherever it may be, or on a global scale. And there have been important studies done showing just that we're seeing decreases in reporting on refugee crisis that appear to be directly linked to these advertising block lists. Those block lists don't just affect kind of humanitarian crises. We know that the same sorts of dynamics are affecting LGBTQ content online and in print. So this is a massive area that requires, as Mickey was talking about at the start of our segment today, critical media literacy, because these are dynamics that are happening outside the visible frame of the content, right? Traditionally, if you think about being critical about news content or other public affairs content, you'd think about looking at, well, what's reported, what's said, what's written. But with algorithmic censorship, right, behind the scenes, we have to be more and more alert, or it requires us to be alert in new ways to how what happens outside of the frame is fundamental to shaping our understanding of what's happening in the world, at whose expense and at whose benefit.
Yeah, and Kevin, really quickly, these companies and these launching of these kind of entities in the throes of the moral panic of fake news, right, with the Trump presidency and the demand and the pressure to control misinformation and disinformation, and the government, of course, has been pressuring big tech to do this. Big tech wants to avoid regulation. These kind of companies themselves are proxies for big tech, like Newsguard, for example. You know, Newsguard is comprised of former government officials like Tom Ridge, the first Homeland Security director, Michael Hayden, who led the CIA during the Bush presidency. I mean, these aren't just, innocuous actors with benevolent goals. These are companies that have an interest in shaping narrative that is directly related to government policy in many ways. The thing that's most disturbing is how this has been accepted. This Trojan horse for censorship is being accepted. Microsoft Edge is using it on their browser, so it's automatically embedded. In other words, it's an outsourcing of critical thinking. So when your browser goes to Mint Press News, for example, and sees a red shield, it's like, whoa, bad news. This is fake news. This is not a good site. But then when you go to Fox or CNN or MSNBC or whatever, it's a green shield. Well, I mean, even though there's noted problems with all the other outlets I just mentioned, and there's notable good reporting at places like Mint Press, these organizations aren't there to actually make fair assessments. They're there to be a proxy authority. And the fact that librarians and educators are beginning to embrace things like Newsguard, even PEN America, they teach sessions on disinformation, and PEN America is promoting Newsguard. It's astounding. It's like, do you not know what these organizations do? They're aiming to curate and shape information in the name of public good, while they're actually censoring key critical voices of the status quo. And that is a major concern. And that's what we try to call attention to with organizations like Newsguard.
And one important point that you're making, or in the framing of your analysis of the Billionaire Press, is the way in which propaganda is defined as being uniquely attributable to, say, Russia or China, or I don't know.
Yeah, just not here.
These days they're not, I guess the most active, but I suppose it could originate from any U.S. enemy country like Iran or North Korea if they had ways to peddle information that was effective. But to me, this is something that has been really escalating since we had all the discussion and focus on alleged Russian interference in the 2016 election. And I always, in my head, went above and beyond to say that, in my opinion, the right-wing news media was more pernicious in its spread of propaganda than anything that could be attributable to the Russian intelligence agencies or Vladimir Putin, or however you want to label it, because that is something that we know from documenting and following it and doing academic work. There's been billions of dollars poured into it. They've built this echo chamber and they're very good at it. In fact, it's even become a study. I don't know if you've had a chance to see any of the segments that, like, Last Week Tonight has put together with their researchers or journalists, but they'll actually cover the way that the echo chamber can push things like critical race theory into our conversation, how they can get these ideas out there that should be fringe, shouldn't really be used to manipulate our culture, but they're able to do so because they have these billions of dollars to push, what I think is misinformation and disinformation. And they do it about gender affirming care. They do it on all kinds of social issues, and they don't get tarred and feathered in the way that people do who can be loosely linked to Russian propagandists. So that being said, there was this disinformation governance board that this was a thing that happened in 2022. It was a problem. It was something that was worthy of criticism. Unfortunately, now, if you are a critic, you are considered to only be on the right wing, because that was where the most of the bulk of the criticism broke through and got coverage in the establishment press. But why don't you tell us what's the status of this? What is this? Why did it become something that you wanted to focus on in the state of the free press?
Yeah, I mean, this is taking us back to April of last year, when the Department of Homeland Security under Joe Biden launched this kind of ominously named Disinformation Governance Board. Its stated purpose was to protect national security by combating foreign sources of information and disinformation, and by advising other DHS agencies. Those aims were all widely criticized across the political spectrum for ambiguities in kind of how you would operationalize that mission, doubts about the integrity of the leadership of the board, et cetera, et cetera. It flopped effectively. Or it was, I guess more precisely, it was made to flop by external critics. And that's a good thing, I think. That should hearten us to some extent. But I think in terms of, as an entity, the Orwellian Disinformation Governance Board may no longer exist. We were assured back at the time that, the board had no operational capacity to control what Americans read or watched. But as Mickey and I write in the introduction to this year's yearbook, that's hardly comforting in light of past revelations about, mass government surveillance of law-abiding citizens by other U.S. governmental agencies. So, I think where this leaves us off is, I think this is one of those things where you could look at that and say, see, the system works. They tried to institute this kind of Orwellian-like entity, and checks and balances, including public accountability, ensured that it didn't happen. And I'm happy to, cheer along with others on that point. But my work with Project Censored alerts me to the reality that just because this isn't happening overtly now doesn't mean the same kind of machinations aren't going on just on lower frequencies, as the protagonist of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man once put it.
They are happening. We know historically they've long happened through places like the CIA and their efforts to control narratives, and they're happening by proxy. This is why the proxy concept is so significant, is because you've got people like Michael Chertoff, who was former head of the Department of Homeland Security. That's a revolving door inside the national security complex. They go from the private sector to government and back again, and they have a regulatory capture over the agencies. And if they can't do something at the agency, out they go to Newsguard. And they've been able to dupe otherwise well-meaning organizations like Penn into thinking that this is a great, quick technological fix. It's like technological determinism, right? It's like, well, tech caused some of these problems. Tech will get us out. And Andy and I and others at the project have just very carefully continued to sound the alarm that that's no way to handle it. Censorship, blacklisting, proxy handling, the private sector, the marketplace of ideas. That's not the antidote to the dissident misinformation. This is why we promote critical media literacy education. This is why we think educating people about media sources, biases, cognitive biases, argumentative fallacies, understanding things like the propaganda model, how ownership, advertising, elite sourcing, flack, and ideology shape and frame news and what's worthy and non-worthy of coverage on the basis of who owns the means of disseminating information, which is why we come back to the owners of the press and the main theme this year. And it's not just the owners of the press, then, therefore, it's the owners and key stakeholders in big tech, big pharma, the military industrial complex. All of these have interlocking directorates with major media outlets, big tech outlets, etc. And that is where information is being controlled and manipulated.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a bit of a tangent, but I just want to raise an example of the revolving door from last year that is incredible. And unfortunately for all of us, it seems like this revolving door is going to keep on spinning until this individual croaks and is no longer alive and breathing. But John Miller, of John Miller? John Miller is somebody who has gone over the last 40 years from local New York City television to working for the NYPD under Bill Bratton, to working for ABC News covering terrorism stories, to working at ABC, to working for the LAPD, to working at the FBI, to working at CBS, to then leaving and working under Bratton again, and then under the NYPD commissioner while Bill de Blasio was mayor. And then now is apparently back at, I believe he's actually back in a position where he is, he's no longer working in news. He's now actually working in a capacity as an intelligence or a police official again. So, sorry. Last year he became a correspondent for one of the news media organizations. So this guy gets some kind of an award for being able to make the revolving door work.
He is dizzying. John Miller is a dizzying character.
So then to close out our discussion, what I would like to raise, and it may take us into some extracurricular discussion that is not necessarily in your book, but is obviously connected to what you discussed. And that is Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. And I think we have to talk about it because, one, we're seeing very clearly how much Twitter seems to be influential or holds so many media institutions captive. And those range from the most corporate to some of very independent alternative organizations have depended on Twitter. I will confess that Shadowproof has been dependent on using Twitter. I've individually been dependent on Twitter to share my coverage and reporting of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And then now we see this individual step in. There's a lot going on with these Twitter files, threads that have been posted on Twitter, with claims and allegations and supposed scoops about Twitter and things that the government were forcing Twitter to do, in which but those have been solely in order to get those stories. For the most part, you have to be reading and consuming that information on Twitter, which is kind of a fascinating development, something that Musk has been requiring that these people, and Matt Taibbi and others, break those stories on the Twitter platform. Let me keep this really broad, and you can take it wherever you would like. What about Musk's ability? I mean, in the book, you have him listed along with Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos. So we should look at him as an oligarch who can manage media coverage of his companies, which not only is now Tesla, but it's Tesla and Twitter, it's SpaceX, it's whatever else.
Starlink, with the military industrial complex,
exactly. All of those projects that he can, and now to including now, apparently in the last week, he's lying about the fact that his father owned an emerald mine, because he can't stand that legacy, that colonial legacy, is being thrown in his face because he's an Afrikaner from South Africa. So in any case, this is an individual now who has quite a lot of power in owning not a newspaper, not a broadcast network, but a social media platform that hundreds of millions of people use to share information.
Yeah, I'll start, and then Mickey, you can jump in. I think we should be concerned about what Elon Musk is doing at and with Twitter, but I want to broaden the kind of question out to 3 increasingly broad levels. So first, yes, the idea that any one person, Elon Musk, has control over a platform as central to kind of everyday life and political life as Twitter that's a problem. We could say more about that, but a next level is the fact of this is highlighted in part because Twitter, there's no comparable platform to Twitter. So a second order problem is not Elon Musk per se, but a media ecosystem where Twitter has come to be so predominant that there are no real alternatives to it. And the third level that I would point, a kind of a third order problem that in some ways, I guess if I'm visualizing this, is the foundation on which the previous two rest, is it's interesting to me that so many people are up in arms about Elon Musk owning Twitter, or having come to own Twitter, or what he's doing with Twitter now that he does own it. But it's sort of taken for granted that 90+% of all of our media content, right? Magazines, newspapers, books, movies, radio, TV, you name it, is controlled by, depending on how you count, 5 or 6 mega corporations. That part of if you want to talk about propaganda in the US, the framing of this as a problem about Elon Musk and Twitter is evident of a larger propagandized understanding of our entire media system, which takes for granted the consolidation of ownership in corporate hands. And that bigger perspective, I think, has to be kept central as we talk about Twitter or Musk and Twitter.
Yeah, I say 100%. I agree with Andy, and we've written about this. There's actually a great dispatches piece at projectcensored.org written by Nolan Higdon, our colleague, called Hunting the Twitter Files, Legacy Media Censored Details About Censorship, that actually talks about a whole myriad of issues and problems surrounding Twitter, the Twitter files. Kevin, you kind of alluded to something earlier, that Musk is kind of controlling which files are leaked to whom, where they have to put them. I mean, that whole enterprise is completely suspect, right? So let's not forget that right there. But let's also acknowledge that people like Taibbi and others that are being selected, when they're reporting this material, when they're reporting that people like Adam Schiff and his committee in Congress contacted Twitter to censor or to flag certain files, that's real. That's a problem. When we see stories, when we see pressure coming from any government agency or political party to squelch a story, whether it's something as seemingly distracting as the Hunter Biden laptop or something else, that's a problem. In the most recent Twitter files, where Alex Berenson from former New York Times writes, Dr. Scott Gottlieb was a former FDA commissioner. He's on the board of Pfizer. He was writing and contacting Twitter senior public policy managers about certain narratives during COVID, which things should be suppressed, which things were disinformation. I don't care what. So here's this issue. The point I'm making. It doesn't necessarily matter if the issue is COVID or Biden's laptop or Ukraine, right? What matters is there are actors behind the scenes that are pushing to censor, to suppress information, to shape narratives, and to silence certain voices. That's the problem, right? And what Andy just described further exacerbates and conceals and kind of shields the problem from really being addressed. And as Andy and Steve Masick wrote in a great Truth Out piece not long ago, the media, the legacy media, mostly, despite all their other failures, one of the biggest failures they have is covering their own backyard, their own shortcomings, their own censorship, their own issues. And by the way, there's nothing new about this in the history of media in the United States. These kinds of they're like rivalries. Big tech attacks the legacy media attacks Twitter, right? Andy and I wrote about that a couple of years ago when we talked about newspapers attacking radio during the Orson Welles kind of thing, right? The War of the Worlds alleged scandal that happened, that radio can't be trusted. It causes moral panics, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't new, in other words. But what we need to see to cut through this is media literacy education. We need the critical thinking skills and access to these kinds of different platforms. We need more access, more information, not less. In other words, we need to decry censorship wherever we see it. Let's pretend we're Democrats and we support the January 6th committee. Fine. That doesn't mean you should support Schiff's office contacting agents in social media to suppress or promote any kind of narratives. That's unethical. And in fact, that's not censorship by proxy per se. We have examples of the FBI directly working with places like Twitter. That is a problem any way you slice it for anybody that cares about the integrity of a free press. I don't care what political party you are outside of being a straight up authoritarian or a fascist.
Yeah. And then that's when, because you said one of the words that can get the algorithm to suppress me. So you mentioned vaccine. So now, like in the last year, you're required to like give a disclaimer, even if you weren't like giving anti-vaxxer bullshit in the middle of your discussion, because you set off some alarm at Google offices. Same if you talk about COVID, I might be talking it in a really intelligent socio-political, social justice manner, thinking about poverty that was inflicted, all kinds of stuff. I have to chime in and be like, look, COVID is serious, people, and make sure you're taking health precautions and see a doctor if you have tested positive. Stuff like that.
Yeah, well, that's the problem of outsourcing this to algorithms or bots. I mean, even like we were mentioning Musk. I think Andy's right on point. The focus on these individuals as controversial is what the media wants to look at, but then they don't look behind at who are those people. Why should these people own this? And Andy and I go down a whole list of people that people maybe never even heard of that own major news publications. That is the theme that we try to highlight in the book this year, State of the Free Press 2023. You can see it at censoredpress.org. You can see it at projectcensored.org. The top stories are online for free. We cover them weekly on the Project Censored radio show. I mean, these are things that we hope folks really pick up and run with these themes and these concepts, because again, no matter whether you're talking about COVID or Ukraine or, the World Cup or whatever, whatever controversies are happening around us in the world, the House selection of the speaker last week, kind of paraphrasing Nick Johnson from the FCC, if your second concern isn't media freedom and media democracy, we're all going to be in the fog and in the dark about key issues. So that's why we really want to promote a diversity in media consumption. We want to promote and encourage young people to be the media. And we want to really encourage people to go out and educate yourself about, around issues of media literacy. Be critical of all the sources. And I would remind us, be critical of the ones we accept the most. Confirmation bias is a powerful drug. And when we see sources that we agree with, we are less inclined to be critical of them. And what we advocate at Project Censored is we try to be equal across the spectrum. And we try to reinforce that while we simultaneously help people. Maybe people have a hard time seeing something because of their cognitive biases. Well, the way around that isn't to censor things or to blacklist or to call people names. It's to open up a broader dialogue, include more information. And that's what we think a successful free press does in a purportedly free society.
Yeah. The process that we've been pushing people towards is to treat them kind of like infants and like, okay, you're too stupid to know that those are incorrect ideas or bad thoughts. And so let's just remove them because you're not capable of sorting through information. Only the like managerial class of this country. We're the ones that know what should be debates and what shouldn't be debates. So I'm gonna give Andy a chance if he's got. It sounds like Mickey, you gave your closing thoughts. I want to give Andy a chance to close out this discussion, but I did just want to put an exclamation point on what you were saying, Mickey, about my concern on how the Twitter files have been handled, and just for something to think about. And I think it's a really good arrangement that is worthy of study and exploration. Because to me, I would much, much prefer it if it was a WikiLeaks style kind of thing that was happening. I don't mind invoking Jack Dorsey, who used to run Twitter and admits that he failed miserably and could have done a whole lot more with Twitter. And he himself has said, I wish that these files, they're not really files, but we'll say these chat logs that are being gone over were available for the entire public to read, and that journalists from around the world, scholars, academics, everyone could look at them and study what was going on with this social media company and U.S. government agencies and other institutions. And the things that you named, FBI, Homeland Security, what was going on with these individuals in the U.S. government, that just scratches the surface. There's the Atlantic Council's Democracy Research Project that we don't have any information on yet. And my colleague Rania Khalek has been just pounding the table. Come on, Taibbi, come on. What were they doing? So there's so much more to be done, but we can't do it because it's just a half dozen commentators, one or two of them you could call journalists or have journalist experience. And we're at there's only so much they can do. And at any moment, Elon Musk can flip the switch and say, you're out, get out of here. We're not doing this anymore. You don't get to look at my systems anymore. Go away.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point, Kevin, goes to one of the foundations of ethical journalism, which is to be transparent and accountable, right? And there might be, we might put, if not red, maybe orange shields by that aspect of the current Twitter kerfluffle. But I want to use Twitter in terms of a kind of a closing observation. Twitter's a useful pivot to talk about something that everyone can do right now that I think will benefit both themselves and the independent news outlets and independent journalists that Project Censored celebrates and champions. And that is to support these organizations and individuals directly. And I want to say a word about what I mean by directly. A lot of people today in the US, maybe not the followers of Shadowproof and Project Censored, but many Americans today are in effect casual consumers of news. They encounter it fleetingly as things that come across, as items that come across a Facebook feed or an Instagram scroll or the Twitter feed. These are not news outlets. These are social media platforms. And so when I say supporting independent news outlets and journalists directly, part of what I mean is bypass those social media platforms. As far as I know, RSS feeds are still a thing. You can get a direct alert every time that Shadowproof has a new posting on its website, right? Or that Project Censored, or you name the independent news outlet. Many of these organizations have old-fashioned e-newsletters that you can subscribe to. And of course, directs and doing so bypasses the algorithmic gatekeepers, right? You may have more email in your inbox, but it'll be coming from sources that you've chosen to trust and support. And that's an important point. The second aspect of direct support is it goes without saying that we can't counter the massive financial treasure chests of these oligarchs, the Adelsons, the Musks, on and on the list goes. But it is very important to support in even the most modest ways possible to support financially independent news outlets. I can speak on behalf of Project Censored and say that we keep the lights on a monthly basis on the basis of people who have committed to giving $5 a month to our organization. Now that's the cost of a fancy coffee at the corner shop. But it makes a huge difference to Project Censored. And I think I probably am speaking accurately when I say that would be true of other independent news outlets as well. So it's important to follow and support independent news outlets directly so that we bypass, as I say, the algorithmic gatekeeping that is so much a part of the censorship by proxy we've been talking about today, and the way that the press is increasingly oligarchic. And it's also a meaningful way to support organizations that are bringing us a more inclusive definition of who and what counts as newsworthy, which for me is the ultimate crux, right? The corporate news is problematic because it has a narrow corporate vision of what counts as newsworthy and who's important. And independent news outlets, we know consistently over nearly 50 years of work at Project Censored, independent news outlets consistently have more inclusive definitions of who is newsworthy and what topics are worth the public's understanding.
Well, thank you both. Let me put this back up here and also take down this banner so we can see this lovely image that this is from the Censored Press, just the publishing arm of Project Censored, as available now, the State of the Free Press 2023. This is a yearly analysis book that you have done. I've been following it. It has the top 25 censored stories in it, along with examples of junk food news and a lot of writing about what goes on in media, as well as media democracy in action. So examples of people who are worth supporting, like Andy was talking about, directly engaging with. And so you should find a copy, buy a copy at a local bookstore, or go on and directly engage with Censored Press or Project Censored and get it and buy a copy. So thank you both. It's been really good to talk with you. Thank you for some of the people who watched this live discussion. And then, of course, it will archive and be available on our channel, and we'll share it and make sure that people have an opportunity to follow everything that we've just discussed, which it was topical in 2022. I expect it to remain just as important as ever in 2023, because none of these issues have been resolved or settled. And in fact, they'll continue to make ripples in the way that we consume and watch the news, etc. So thank you both. With that, I'm going to sign off here. And I just tell everyone thank you for following the Shadowproof YouTube channel. Make sure again that you are following and are actually subscribed to the channel. You'll get a notification the next time we host a discussion like this. But until next time, I'll see you all around.